Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Eastern Shore baseball reaches back decades with names like the Cambridge Canners and the Pocomoke City Salamanders. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. These days, if a fan wants to see a game, they'll show up at the Purdue Stadium in Salisbury to watch the Shorebirds. But there was a time when local baseball teams flourished up and down the peninsula. The Nabb Research Center for Delmarva History and Culture is hosting an exhibit entitled Eastern Shore Pastime 100 Years of Baseball. In our studio this morning is Creston. He's director of the Nabb Research Center. Welcome to the program.
Oh, very good to be here. Thank you.
So let me ask you this. What was the inspiration for putting together this exhibit?
Well, we had an opportunity about 2 years ago to pursue a grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities that is called the Common Heritage Grant Program. And it provides some funding for institutions like the Nabb Center or historical societies, archives, to try to reach out into the surrounding community, to build up a collection that is connected to some element of community. So we had this knowledge that from the late 19th century through the last third of the 20th century, that baseball was a major part of community life during the summer season throughout Delmarva. And we knew that, but we also had very little in our own archives that reflected that history. So we started putting together this idea that maybe we could build an application around the idea of community baseball, and that we would build a digital archive of items that people from the community brought in for us to scan or take digital photographs of. And then we would build to an exhibit and a publication that tries to capture some of that past. So that was about 2 years ago when we were doing the grant application. And then in late 2018, we received word that we had indeed been accepted, and the program started it was actually last May. We had a panel discussion with two former Eastern Shore baseball players and two community historians who really have devoted a lot of time to collecting items, but also really trying to understand the history of baseball on Delmarva.
So the history reaches back late 1800s.
Yes.
As it were. Tell me a little bit about how this comes about. How is it developed?
Well, I mean, the earliest the sort of evidence that we can find of baseball becoming a real presence on the Eastern Shore in small towns and starting to develop a following was in the years right after the Civil War. There was nothing quite like league play at that point. That would develop over the next few decades. But it's not a truly local phenomenon. This was becoming a national pastime. And really throughout much of the 20th century, it would remain the sport that many Americans would think of first when they thought of community sports, but also on the national level. So it starts developing in the late 19th century, and we start to see more formalized league play by that time. Now, the Eastern Shore Baseball Leagues, formerly named the Eastern Shore Baseball League, those come along in the sort of early middle decades of the 20th century. But in the few items that we did have in our existing Nabb Center archives were from that early period, the 1870s, 1890s. We had several photographs, really just a handful, of baseball teams from this area, from the Salisbury area. And they were small teams, but it had fairly uniforms that they were wearing. You could see the equipment, and they really are fascinating pictures. There's also a picture that we had of a women's baseball team in the Princess Anne area. and that was also a national pattern in the late 19th century as well.
What sense do you get about the difference between, on the one hand, obviously what we consider modern baseball today, and those early days?
Well, in those early times, it really, from what we've gathered in this project, the teams that small towns would field really were homegrown operations. So in communities, really, some as I think Parksley, Virginia, might be one of the smaller towns that we have some material on, fielded a team. We're talking about a population of several hundred people, but out of that community, they'd field a team, and then from the surrounding area would sometimes draw in for weekend games an attendance larger than the population of the town itself. So during the time in which there were, well, frankly, jobs available throughout these small towns on Delmarva, so a lot of them were related to the developing seafood industry of the late 19th century. Others were connected to canning of agricultural products. So long as little towns outside of the larger cities, not large, but places like Pocomoke and Princess Anne and Salisbury, if we take those as sort of the population centers and go outside of them to the much smaller places, so long as there were jobs there that could sustain a population, we find that that's where the baseball teams were. And then over the course of the mid-20th century, as some of those operations began closing down, that's when we see the contraction of baseball into these larger population areas. So really, to get back to your question, it was at the core of community life during the summer. Often we'd find family members playing on the same team, sort of, in some cases, a family tradition, multiple generations having played in earlier years. And they had a true sense of community. And that is something that we don't really see now.
Now, one of in researching this, Dorchester County, I guess, had its first major league player from the Eastern Shore, Homer Doc Smoot.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that and how the leagues or the players began to filter into the national level.
Right. Well, it's, there was I'm not going to get the numbers right here, but there was an seemingly unusual number of Eastern Shore baseball players. Some who had grown up here, others who had moved here, but who went on to play in the major leagues. And there are several towns that really stand out. The one that I probably know best is Federalsburg. There were over a dozen players who played in the Federalsburg minor league teams that went on to play in the majors, and some of great, wide name recognition. Once league play began in the early 1920s, and then there were 3 renditions of the Eastern Shore Baseball League. During that time, that's when we've found sort of an increasing number of players moving on to the shore to play on these teams. And that number of players that would then go on to the majors goes up from there. But again, we can find examples from the early 20th century. And really, it was a system that predates the farm team system that we have now, and that's existed through a good portion of the 20th century to the current day. The farm system would, I think, basically grow out of that. But there were a number of standout players and several Hall of Famers that had their start here on the Eastern Shore that would then go on to the very highest honors of professional baseball.
So now they create this league. I guess it's the Salisbury Chamber of Commerce begins the formation of a Class D Eastern Shore League. What was the impetus for that at that point? Was there this commercial interest, or what were they thinking?
Well, if we look at those early, certainly there was a commercial opportunity there. And I don't think we have a precise answer on this, but if we look at the timing of the creation of that league in the very early 1920s. It dates to about the same time that the Major League Baseball was recovering from the great scandal of cheating during the World Series. And when there are those sorts of infringements of the rules, a league can take a hit as far as interest and attendance. And I suspect that the timing of the growth of some of these other minor league teams might have had something to do with an effort to rejuvenate interest in baseball. It didn't collapse, obviously, but to formalize it a bit, to, again, try to take advantage of the commercial opportunity behind it. There are several things that come together during that first rendition of the Eastern Shore Baseball League.
Now, as a matter of fact, when I was looking at the league name or the team names, they're not traditional. I mentioned a moment ago, Cambridge Canners, Chrisfield Crabbers, Pocomo City Salamanders. I'm not sure where they come. Can you tell us a little bit about
that one? I don't know, but sometimes so in some cases, they were names that were popular across the nation, right? We can find several, for instance, the Dodgers or the Cardinals. There was the Salisbury Cardinals very early on. These were names that were taking root in other places. But as far as the ones that are unique, right? The Parksley Spuds.
Right, Spuds, yes.
We today, there is still some potato production down on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, but it was connected directly to that. One of my favorites is, again, a Federalsburg team, the Federalsburg Button Dusters. It's perhaps not widely known outside of Federalsburg, but there was a pretty large button-producing factory in Federalsburg. There were several others on the Eastern Shore. It was during the time where there was a lot of textile production here on Delmarva, and in connection with that were these button factories. So in Federalsburg, there was a button company, and the team took its name from that.
Of course, this is also occurring at a time of Jim Crow, which you have separate teams. Tell me a little bit about the African American teams.
Certainly. So they're from some of the earliest days of baseball organization in the last third of the 19th century. There was this question: would African American baseball players, be able to play on teams that also had white players? And there was a position taken very early on that no, indeed not. So from that point on, there developed really a parallel league for African American players at the upper levels of professional baseball, as well as more in the local scene. So there were several of these African American baseball leagues throughout the 20th century, and for the ones that we studied the most, the community-based ones, in general, they would play other African American teams from other surrounding communities, but they also budgeted and saved to go play out of state, play on the other side of the bay, play up in southern New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and these were teams that enjoyed considerable support from their communities, enough support to fund travel, but also have uniforms and purchase equipment when it was necessary. So it carries on really this sort of parallel play through the 1960s, and that is when the Eastern Shore, the name at the time was Eastern Shore Negro League. It basically, once integration starts happening on a larger level, it essentially starts contracting and stops. Right. Now, some of the teams that had been part of that continued to play, and probably the best example, the most documented one that we have anyway, is the Oaksville Eagles. That is a community not that far outside of Princess Anne, and that's a team that had formed decades earlier. It had had a number of seasons that were really quite extraordinary, and it was one of those teams that had a long set of family traditions of players from multiple generations. It continued as an all African American team, playing just other teams in the area through even into the very early 1980s. But by that time, in general, by the early 1980s, late 70s, a lot of these community-based baseball teams had either stopped, or at this time we continue to see like company teams playing, teams that were connected to places of work, and those in some cases were, they still continue today actually. So it's an interesting history. We can certainly see in this project that all of the general patterns of society and divisions within society are reflected in baseball itself. With that said, the gentleman that we interviewed who had played for years with the Oaksville Eagles and is sort of the historian of the team now. Mm-hmm. His name is Dr. Kirkland Hall. He has a long baseball career of himself and then a career in coaching and teaching. He pointed out that for their games, in Oaksville, they would have crowds that were African American and white. So there was a bit of a breakdown of that barrier there.
Now, as a matter of fact, you have a poster of William Julius Judy Johnson. Tell me a little bit about him. Why you particularly you?
He was a major player in the first half of the 20th century. Out of Snow Hill, he would play primarily in the African American League at the major league level, and he has been a subject of other exhibits fairly recently here on Delmarva. So there have been other places that have done quite a bit with his history. But he had started play in the second decade of the 20th century. So we're going back a ways here. And his career would continue, really working in baseball would continue. We can count his time working with the Hall of Fame up into the 1970s. He served as a member of essentially the board, he was a fellow of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And once integration happened at the major league level, he played an important role in promoting the play of African American players and promoting elevation into the Hall of Fame. So he died in 1989 in Wilmington, Delaware, but he had gotten his start. He was born in Snow Hill and was an excellent hitter, an excellent fielder. Generally, he was an athlete all around. He initially had some training as a boxer, as a very, very young person, but he really stood out as a baseball player and played in New Jersey, played in Philadelphia, and continued his connection to baseball really through the 1970s. Now, when he was nominated to become part of the Hall of Fame, that is when he resigned his position with the Hall of Fame, so that could seem like it just seemed fitting for him to do that at the time. So he was the sixth African American player that was admitted to the Hall of Fame.
Now, the league goes on for a while, but then in the 1930s, there's a hiatus. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so there are, again, three renditions of the Eastern Shore Baseball League. There was the 20s version, 1921 through about 1928, and from the best we can tell, it really ended that time of it. We suspect because of economic issues. The Depression was not yet apparent on a national scale, but some of the early signs were there. And we don't have an answer that's a whole lot better than that. It comes back in 1937, and then its second stint ends in 1942, and that appears to be directly connected to World War II. Then the third try at the Eastern Shore Baseball League, it was really the shortest of them. And that was basically in the late 1940s, after the war, and then it would end in 1948. And don't have solid explanation for that, but someone that we've worked with connected to the Eastern Shore Baseball Hall of Fame Museum. And they've been great partners in this entire project. We can talk more about that later if you want. But he speculated that the development of television and the ability to watch games, which in 1948 that would have just been starting and it would have been of limited access to a lot of people, but that it started then and gave another opportunity to experience baseball, that may have contributed to the end of the Eastern Shore Baseball League at that point. Now, league play goes on. There's the Central Shore League that develops not long after that, but the name the Eastern Shore Baseball League, it passes from usage at that time.
Well, we couldn't get away with not talking about a scandal of our own. The Salisbury apparently was penalized in 1937 for breaking some rules. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, there was a rule that had to do with who was allowed to play. And players of so much experience were supposed to be limited in how much playtime they were actually supposed to have. And there was apparently a violation of that the commissioner ruled, and he wanted to really to begin enforcing rules at that point and to make a good example of that. And there was some legitimacy to it, although it is disputable. He made this ruling that Salisbury would have to forfeit essentially the first half of its season. And it was in the second half of the season that the Salisbury team committed to doing its absolute best and managed to maintain this winning streak that essentially won them the pennant in the league that year. And it's known as one of the greatest teams in minor league play and one of the greatest seasons for a team in minor league play because of that great comeback. So, it was an attempt to really assert the rules, to say these are important. We do have a league. There is going to be observation and enforcement of these rules. But the real story is, the fun part of it is that there was this great comeback, and that would go down in history. So we have that as part of our exhibit. Also, the Eastern Shore Baseball Hall of Fame, they commemorate that comeback in their museum as well.
So when we look at, for instance, as we appreciate this kind of history, we obviously have at the Shorebirds, there's a little museum. Tell me a little bit about that, and how does that come about? What is the history, by the way, of the Shorebirds and coming on? How does all that?
It took several things. It took a location and some authority willing to take ownership of the process of building and sustaining a stadium, and it also took finding a team that would come to Delmarva, come to Wicomico County, and how would it be connected to the majors. So it's in the first few years of the 1990s that effort picks up. There was a donation of land from Purdue. There was a personal donation from Frank Purdue himself of a couple $1 million towards this effort. And then there was a team, which frankly I don't remember exactly where it had been before, or that part I'm a bit fuzzy on. But in its initial season, it was connected to the Montreal Expos. And that was just for a year. And then from that point on, it is affiliated even today with the Baltimore Orioles. So the Purdue Stadium and the surrounding land, the parking lots, that is part of the county. And the Eastern Shore Baseball Hall of Fame and the museum space that's there, it has been there since the earliest days of the stadium. And its mission is to, well, for one thing, support the work of the Hall of Fame, the Eastern Shore Baseball Hall of Fame. Every November they have an induction of new members, and they have a vetting process that takes place before that. So there's that, but they also try to portray the history of Eastern Shore baseball. And really, it's a very good museum. they have quite a bit there. They have loaned a number of items to our exhibit that is up through mid-July. And we also, though, in meeting with them, in planning all of this, they also suspected that there were a number of items that people have in private collections that they would like to know about, that we could share. So part of this from the very start has been to, when we scan or take digital photographs of items, we put them into a digital archive. And also the Eastern Shore Baseball Hall of Fame Museum, they will also receive a hard drive that has those images. So when someone brings in an item for scanning, they sign an agreement that it's okay for us to scan the item, that they're okay with us archiving it, but also using it for things like this exhibit. So it's been a good partnership with that museum, and their collection is very impressive. They've got some jerseys that date back to the very early 20th century, mitts and bats and old photographs that don't really exist anywhere else. So it is definitely worth visiting there. They're open when the Shorebirds are playing.
And I would encourage, by the way, people that stop by, they're like right off the entrance, I believe, as I remember it. So tell me a little bit about the kind of items that you have on display. I was actually there the other day. So you have uniforms. You even have some what looks like old films of some of the old teams. Tell me a little bit about the kind of items that you decided that you wanted to have and why you wanted to have them.
Well, the items that we chose for the exhibit, we think do have some visual appeal. As I can talk about those films for just a second here. We have them scrolling on a digital monitor in the exhibit. And one of those, there are two basic clips on there. One dates to 1927, Salisbury, and it shows the beginning of a baseball game, sort of almost like a parade into the stadium. It was Gordy Field, which is over where Eastern Shore Drive is now, where the Salvation Army is today. That was the basic location of Gordy Park. And there is several minutes of footage of the baseball players, a minute or so of them actually playing the game, and it's in remarkably good shape. For 1927, we actually had that item in our archives. That was probably the one of the most interesting pieces. The other film there is mostly connected to the town of Federalsburg, some other footage that has survived from the mid-20th century. And those have visual appeal, and they're just fascinating to watch something that old. They're both just visual. There's no sound to them. There is a soundtrack that was added to them, but you don't hear the crowd or anything like that. The other items we chose, again, try to represent a good, inclusive history of baseball on the Eastern Shore, and have items, again, that have that. In museums, different sorts of items speak to different people. Really, the jerseys tend to be, for me, they stand out a lot. They've the name of the team, the colors, and they're often jerseys that players actually wore. That's a very personal connection that you can feel when you see an item like that. So there's always selection that goes on when putting together a museum. I do want to say we do have two exhibits, actually. There's one on the first floor of the Grury Academic Commons, and that is almost exclusively photographs of teams from around Delmarva. Teams and some portraits, some smaller shots, but a lot of photographs down the first floor. It's up in our fourth floor Thompson Gallery, where we have the Friends and Rivals Eastern Shore Baseball exhibit. And that goes into a bit more history than you would read down on the first floor.
We've been speaking with Creston Long. He's director of the Nabb Research Center, and we appreciate you taking the time to stop by, and certainly encourage people to stop by and see the exhibit.
Well, thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.